And last but far from least, the battling Ben Shapiro. First question is for Ben. The way I arranged this is I'll ask a question of an individual panelist. That panelist will have a chance to answer. Everybody else will then have an opportunity to chime in. I only ask that we try to alternate views so that if one panelist might go over a certain amount of time, I might interject and try and guide us to speeding along the conversation. But other than that, it's a rather free-form panel today. Question number one is for Ben Shapiro. Ben, on the Piers Morgan show, you said, and I'm quoting, "I believe in background checks." Then Piers Morgan said, "For everybody?" And then you said, "Yes, for everybody." Does that mean that we should support Initiative 594?
What I said is that philosophically I don't disagree with background checks, and I think philosophically it's actually very difficult to disagree with background checks in a perfect world where you have instant verification, where you can go in, somebody can check, and that's that. The reason I don't support I-594 is because we don't live in that magical world. If background checks were universally effective, I think, again, it would be on a philosophical level very difficult to disagree with them, because I think that everybody across the country can agree on the basic proposition that we want guns in the hands of good people or responsible people, and we don't want guns in the hands of bad or irresponsible people. If background checks were, I think, more effective in achieving that, that would be one thing. I don't think that this particular initiative, which is 18 pages of mishmash, which I've read now multiple times, and each time I read it I come up with a new meaning. It's like liberals with the Constitution. It's not a particularly well-drafted statute. It's not something that I think is going to be particularly effective. And so again, on an ideological level, background checks sound great. On a practical level, when you get down to drafting, it gets a little more complicated.
That individual got a gun from a gun show, directly from a gun show, because he knew there was no background check. It was a convenient way to do it. And if you're a felon, or you're somebody intent on a felony, that's where you're going to get your guns. So that's why I think, almost unanimously, we agreed to the concept of background checks.
Ben?
I think that it's easy to move to the holistic when it really is just a problem of the human. The guns are a tool just like anything else. And the reality is that the states with the lowest gun homicide rate in the nations are, in order, New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Idaho, North Dakota, and Montana. None of those states have significant gun laws. None of them. The reason for that is because the folks who live in those states are different than the folks who live in states with high rates of gun crime. If you actually want to solve the problem of gun crime, you have to solve the underlying problem with it, which is crime. Right? And instead of focusing on the implement that is used to commit the crime, we need to be focused on how we actually get the crime rates down. The truth is that one of the reasons that you've seen such tremendous declines in crime in some of the states that you mentioned, Ralph, is because across the country, we've seen a tremendous decline in the amount of crime in the country. We've actually seen tremendous declines in domestic violence, domestic assault across the country over the last 20 years. In terms of intimate partner violence, we've seen a decline of 72%. I mean, these are massive drops, and one of the reasons for that is not increased gun laws. Gun laws have actually been loosened in many cases, especially at the federal level. The reason for that is because you've actually seen longer sentences for criminals. I mean, if you keep criminals in prison, it turns out one of the benefits is that criminals are in prison.
So it was understandable. You were able to come down to, yes, you think that this is an effective way of reducing the odds that someone violent would get a gun. And that would,
well, it's better than doing
means.
Nothing. I mean, the only alternative is to say let's give up and accept.
Ben, is that the only alternative?
No, I don't think that's the only alternative. I don't understand why we don't have an alternative in terms of actually fighting crime itself. I mean, what we are doing is we are creating a whole new class of crime in which an enormous number of people who are not committing crimes other than transferring a weapon to, for example, a sister-in-law could theoretically be swept up by a prosecutor in that. Now, we've been assured by people that they are not going to apply the law as written in cases where they don't feel that it's necessary to do so. But really, I mean, this initiative is vague. It is poorly defined. The definitions are poor. There are many holes in it. And the best that the state seems to be doing with I-94 is, well, trust us, we'll enforce it right. And if that were the case, if that were the case, if we could trust the state to enforce things correctly, then we wouldn't have half of the problems with violence in the state that we currently have.
Okay, forget 594. What do you want to do?
What do I want to do? Okay.
How would you change the enforcement of crime to
longer sentences for criminals?
And regardless of the...
And by the way...
you are willing to pay for, regardless of the expense?
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely. And Dave, a completely different approach to serious mental health issues.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the reasons that we have right now, and people will see this going home tonight, that we have an unbelievable and unprecedented number of tents and a brand new Nicholsville right at the intersection of I-5 and I-90, and we have more homeless people camping than ever before, is because we don't commit people. And what we do is we have this idea that somehow it's virtuous to encourage people to camp on public property, which is destructive to them.
And all the easy availability of guns, it's a toxic mix. Here's the thing, though. We are not that violent a society. If you look at our crimes of aggression, rape, assault, burglary, we are no more violent on a per capita basis than Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the other so-called frontier countries. What we do is have a 4 times higher rate of suicide because of easy access to guns. So we're not...
because of lack of mental care. I mean, you just mentioned there's a lack of mental care for people who are size.
I
agree. I have mental ill people in my family. The care here is terrible. It's terrible.
Everybody has mental health. I mean, they argue, and I believe 1 out of 5 people are just not really mentally balanced. We all agree we have to do a better job of mental health.
How many are on the stage?
I know. Yeah. But this notion that we got to put everybody in jail, we're not that violent a society, and we had overcrowded prisons to begin with, and half of them were there for drug laws that I think they shouldn't be in jail to begin with.
Well, that's an argument about drug laws, but not about violent crime. I mean, the problem that we have in large measure with regard to crimes that are committed with guns are people who committed previous crimes, they get out and then they commit another crime with a gun.
I just want people to remember what we've committed to here. So longer sentences, we already incarcerate more than any other country, so that will be an expense. Free mental health care, regardless of income, plus housing.
Free mental health care for people who are committed.
And Obamacare.
Well, that's what we're getting to. Yeah. I mean, so no pre-existing conditions. Anybody who needs mental health care can get it. You don't want to get to the point where they have to be committed, right? If you could stop the problem before they need commitment, which is full-time, 24/7 housing.
It's their responsibility to stop it before they need commitment, right. But if they need commitment, they ought to be committed.
So here's I think there's a point. Regardless.
Wait a second. So you're talking about Fast and Furious? Yeah. So it's important to control weapons and whose hands they fall into.
Well, when it comes to in that case.
No, it's important to control weapons and whose hands they fall into because those weapons were used to kill an American border agent, correct?
That's correct. And the ATF knew was going.
The government regulate those weapons.
The government green-lighting particular sales to drug cartels.
That is bad. If it's bad for the government to do it, it's bad for anyone.
Wait. I don't think that anybody up here, and we began this way, Dave. I don't think anybody up here opposes the idea that weapons should be kept away from the hands of bad actors.
Exactly.
We all agree. Okay, the question is, how do you do that? And I say that you do that by focusing on the actor, not the weapon. Yes. This whole idea...
And this is about enforcement, so whose job should it be to go after the bad guy with the weapon?
The government, of course.
Exactly.
And not to provide the weapon to the bad guy.
Absolutely. Amen. And so which government agency
and by the way, to go after bad guys without weapons, too.
All right,
we shouldn't wait until they have weapons. This idea that the easiest place to stop a bad guy is to transfer a weapon is not true.
Tremendous youth to have guns to be penalized and keep guns away from them, and we couldn't get that passed. I mean, that's political dysfunction that is really at the heart of this to a large degree.
Well, I mean, I agree there's political dysfunction. What I don't understand is why gun control is always the #1 agenda item. I mean, everyone on this stage basically agrees on mental health. I think everybody on the stage basically agrees on more penalties for people who commit serious crimes. Why is it that these things are secondary, but when it comes to gun confiscation or gun transfer or regulation thereof, which I think we all have to admit is at the margins. Okay, the evidence shows this is the best case for background checks shows that the evidence is mixed. Okay. That is the best case for background checks. Why are we messing around at the margins when the heart of the issue is really all these other issues that we're talking about?
We agree on that. But here's why I wish it was #1 on the agenda, but I wish it was in a pragmatic way. But here's the issue. More people now die from gun violence in the state than die from car accidents. And there are
80% of that suicide.
But suicide matters.
I agree suicide matters, but the suggestion that guns are responsible for suicide as opposed to the person whose finger is on the trigger of the gun is absurd to me.
Well, when you get a 34% efficacy rate versus 2% for non-guns, and the majority of suicides are done by firearms, I think guns and suicide are a toxic mix.
Well, if you're mentally ill, you shouldn't have a gun in the first place, so we're back to mental illness.
We agree. So let's pass I-594 to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. Gun show. So gun shows are private sales. You can sell a couple of guns, but you had black market dealers that were selling 50 AK-47s a session against the law. Those people should have been, by definition, federally licensed firearm dealers. So it's designed at some point to prevent the bad guys from doing it. It's not a gotcha. Nobody wants gotcha for the average everyday citizen put in jail, and it will not happen that way because we have precedent in California and Oregon.
Well, it should be okay. Let me tell you a little bit about the precedent in California for a second. In California, there are 30,000 mentally ill people who have guns. They have a grand total of 33 people, really, in the state of California who are tasked with taking these 30,000 guns away from these 30,000 mentally ill people. Okay, we're creating a system that is either not going to be enforced or it's going to be over-enforced. This idea, if we can just trust the government, then why aren't we just trusting the government to do the right thing now? I don't understand why a piece of legislation makes them better at what they do. I mean, the government is not very good at what they're doing now. Why does new wording make them not suck?
Because part of the reason... Part of the reason you have a law or initiative as a deterrent, that government won't even be involved, that the bad guys won't be going to gun shows to buy guns, so they have to circumvent it.
Well, but that's exactly the point. If bad guys are not going to gun shows with regard to Ebola, and for a second, this is a mild digression. With regard to Ebola, the federal government just made the case that they don't want a federal travel ban, right? Because they said if there's a federal travel ban, people will just find a way to circumvent the federal travel ban. Okay, do you see the analogy here?
Yeah, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm here to talk about guns. And most people are law-abiding citizens on that. So, I think one of the reasons you have laws is a deterrent to make sure that people do the right thing.
Well, I agree, but this is the attendant cost. Right? If there are law-abiding... The cost is a law-abiding citizen, for example, under the bill, who wants to loan a gun to a family member for purposes of defending themselves. The bill talks about it has to be in the case only of the most basically emergency situations. Well, how does the government define that? It's undefined in the bill. Right? I mean, so I have a cousin or I have a sister-in-law who feels endangered by her husband. If I give her the gun, and she says, I feel endangered. And she keeps it for a week, but the government only decides that she was endangered for 3 days, and the gun is stolen and used, then she can be prosecuted, I can be prosecuted, as well as the criminal.
And you'll never be prosecuted. It's never happened.
So again, it comes down to faith in government.
You'll never